So last weekend, we turned our clocks back with the end of daylight saving time for the year. You know, it's kind of a mixed bag because it means the days are now darker an hour sooner, although the transition is a lot easier this time of year than it is in the spring when we have to move forward. And we got an extra hour of sleep last weekend. That was kind of nice. But with the transition out of or into daylight saving time, there's this semi-annual debate that takes place about whether or not we should have daylight saving time at all. And I read an article, a National Geographic article last week, giving not only the history behind the clock shift, but also some arguments for doing away with it, including studies suggesting that it may be bad for our health, at least in the spring when we move our clocks head forward an hour. I'm not sure I buy all of the complaints, given that this is an adjustment that takes place only twice a year, but many are calling for the elimination of it. So, we do like to complain, don't we? When things don't stack up to our preferences or our perceptions. And that's what's behind the scripture we heard today, just moments ago, from the Old Testament book of Haggai. By the way, for those who look at it, and you may wonder, this is not the Latin plural for that not-so-delicious Scottish dish, haggis. Haggai is another of those prophets that I'd never preached on before, and his book, and Brandon's right, it's between the two Z's. It's two down from Habakkuk. If you were here, if you heard that sermon 2 weeks ago, there's not a whole lot known about the person Haggai, but we do know a fair amount about when he acted as a prophet. It's found within the book itself, and biblical scholars accept those dates as accurate. His term as a prophet, at least based on the book bearing his name, was for a short period of time, only about 4 months in the year 520 BC. But it's not so surprising that a prophet's time in active ministry is short, because you can only take a prophetic word for so much before it really becomes problematic. And so the prophets didn't stay around a lot of times for a long extended period. That's true today as well. The historical backdrop is essential to understanding Haggai's message. Early in the 6th century BC, the Babylonian Empire destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And then in 539 BC, the Persians arose as a dominant power in that part of the world and conquered Babylon. A year later, in 538 BC, their king, Cyrus, issued a decree allowing Jews who had been exiled in Babylon to return to their home of Jerusalem. And he directed that sacred furnishings from the temple be returned, and he even promised and provided the Jews with financial assistance for rebuilding their temple. It's really amazing. The book of Ezra refers to this amazing action by the Persian king and affirms, along with the book of Isaiah, that Cyrus was guided by God to act on behalf of the people of Israel. Now, that certainly does seem to be the case, and it's amazing, isn't it, how God can use anyone God chooses to fulfill God's purposes, even those who are seen as the enemy. That should cause us to pause a little bit before we start judging people as unworthy, because if God calls someone, that person can be the instrument through which God's grace flows, even if we don't recognize such promise in him or her. And so I ask you this question: who among us today may have a special calling from God that we don't yet recognize? It's something to ponder, isn't it? Anyway, many Jews returned to Jerusalem, and reconstruction of the temple began, but eventually they lost their head of steam. And evidently they became more focused on rebuilding their own homes. This may have been in part because there was all this opposition to them building the temple again from their neighbors, like the Samaritans. And that may be because they kind of liked the idea that there was not this formal nation of Judah in the region anymore for all those years, and they feared that the temple would put the Jews back on the map, so to speak. For whatever reason, by the time of Haggai's prophecy in 520 BC, which was, as it said, during the reign of Darius of Persia. The Jews had gotten no further with rebuilding the temple than the foundation. As commentator Martha Stern and others note, God is engaged in human history and speaks through persons such as the prophets of the Old Testament. In today's scripture, Haggai is directed by God to call out key Jewish leaders and all the people for being so slack and getting going with the rebuild of the temple, and to encourage them to move on it, to get on with it. And the prophet prods the people with three questions, really interesting questions that caught my attention as I was studying for this passage today, which was pre-assigned to this Sunday, which just happens to be Generosity Commitment Sunday at our church. And I wondered what God might be asking us here at Providence UMC at this time in our history. The first question Haggai was told by God to ask was, who is left among you that saw this house in its former glory? Who is left among you that saw this house in its former glory? The exile of the Jews to Babylon was a half a century in length, and for some it was even more. In fact, counting from the destruction of the temple to the time Haggai was prophesying in 520 BC, it was nearly 70 years. Apparently, some of those who were now looking at the modest progress on reconstruction of the temple were criticizing even that as not stacking up to what they had seen before with Solomon's temple. I mean, they hadn't even seen the temple yet. They just saw the foundation, and they're already grousing, well, it doesn't look as good as Solomon's temple. Who was likely still around to remember really what the former temple looked like 70 years later? Or were their memories more just a product of their own imagination? We're finally coming out of our own Babylonian exile, aren't we? The COVID-19 pandemic has left its mark on our church and on churches all across our nation and the world. It may not have been 50 to 70 years, although it felt like that sometimes, didn't it? Church attendance and engagement has bounced back, but to be honest, it's not what it was before COVID. And that is true of almost all churches. I've talked with pastors everywhere. This is a phenomenon that has happened worldwide. COVID has caused a change. Churches can get what Martha Stern calls Camelot memory. A lot of you aren't old enough to know what that reference is, but back in the 60s, this wonderful musical, and they used to refer to the Kennedy administration as Camelot because it evoked these wonderful feelings of the past. And she says that churches can get this Camelot memory with an idealized recollection of the glory days of the church, whatever that looked like. And even if the church has had days where it was bursting at the seams with worshipers and participation in ministries and fellowship activities was higher than experienced now, there is a danger in focusing too much on the past. Just as you can't drive a car forward safely if you're spending all your time looking in the rearview mirror, you can't move forward in a church if your gaze is always backward. It kills the hope and joy found in new ministries and activities when all we see is what used to be. Positive ministry efforts, even when wonderful and successful by objective measures, are seen instead as failures because they don't compare to the Camelot memory. The second question asked by the prophet was, how does it look to you now? This calls for an honest assessment. I'd suggest there's a lot to celebrate, but there are also concerns. And not just with regard to this congregation, but to the greater church and the world around us. Listen to these words of Bishop Will Willimon and Robert Wilson from a book they co-authored. We are convinced that the United Methodist Church faces a crisis unequaled to any since the schism preceding the Civil War. The continued membership decline is the major symptom of this crisis, but the issues are deeper and more complex than the loss of members. And then they say, the crisis in the church is much more serious than many people realize. No defenses or alibis can hide the fact that if we continue in the future, as we have in the recent past, our church will no longer be viable and effective. Although they immediately add that they're convinced God still has a use for the United Methodist Church, and they are confident that the people known as United Methodists continue to be called to witness and to serve. By the way, those disconcerting words were written in 1987. 1987. Yeah, we've got big challenges facing us in the United Methodist Church, but based on what Willimon and Wilson wrote 35 years ago, I'd say there's a much bigger challenge facing all churches in the Western world in our loss of relevancy to way too many people. That's the thing we should be focused on and worried about. Europe is far ahead of us in this regard, but we're catching up, and COVID has accelerated the trend toward lower attendance and commitment to worship. And just to be clear, by the way, for those who are worshiping with us online, I'm very grateful that you are. I'm really talking about those who have drifted from a regular pattern of worship in person or online. There's no substitute, of course, for being together, but it's just not always an option for everybody. And I'm so glad that we can offer online worship, that you're part of this. But what I'm talking about is folks who have drifted away from worshiping at all. The question that remains is just how committed are we right now to our church? We're calling this Generosity Commitment Sunday for a reason. When we make a pledge to give to the church, we're making a commitment to the church and its ministries and, more importantly, to God. And it's an act of faith. Our proclamation that we trust God to take care of us as we pledge a portion of our financial resources to the mission of the church. The third and final question Haggai asked was, is it not in your sight as nothing? Is it not in your sight as nothing? It was a hard one for me to kind of even figure out what it was saying. But in other words, God, through the prophet, is challenging the people who had been freed from captivity in Babylon and now looked with disdain or lack of concern on the new temple being built. They cared so little about it that they saw it as nothing. And yet, it wasn't just the temple itself, the building itself, that was being overlooked by them, but it was what the temple represented and what it facilitated and what it focused on, which was worshiping God and establishing and nurturing the fellowship of the faith community. Those things were being ignored as well when they looked at it and said it's nothing. God wanted them to care, to commit to the restoration of worship and the faith community, as well as the place of worship being rebuilt. After these three challenging questions, Haggai had a very positive word for the people of God from God. 3 times he told them to take courage, and God assured them that he would be with them and they should not be afraid. How comforting it is to know that we are not alone, that God is with us. The final word in this passage, however, may be the one that brings the greatest hope. It must have been a great encouragement to those who were returning to Jerusalem and found it nothing like it was before they left. God says that the future glory of the house of God will be even greater than it was in the past. In other words, even if the people have rear view mirror images of Solomon's temple, and they think it was brighter than what they see right now, God was going to make it even more glorious than their Camelot memories. I see the same for this church, for our church. As great as Providence UMC has been in its first almost 70 years, I see on the road ahead of us even greater days to the glory of God. I see our continued support for the people of Haiti and Dr. Eugene's hospital, both in new and creative ways that overcome the obstacles preventing our traveling there. I see on the road ahead of us more and more meals packed in Rise Against Hunger events, such as what we have this afternoon, that eventually feed hundreds of thousands or 1 million people across the world collectively. Not just in one, just by the way, Brandon's getting a little nervous all of a sudden when but eventually we'll hit the 1 million meal mark. Wouldn't that be awesome? We can do that. I see Room in the Inn helping so many more homeless persons in the years to come find a night of warmth and care here at our church that warms their souls as well. I see on the road ahead a new and delightful problem: not enough parking on Sunday mornings because hundreds of persons whom we've not yet met have found their way to this church, into our worship services, where they've been greeted by such warm hospitality and such meaningful encounter with God that they make this their spiritual home. I see on the road ahead of us our children's ministry blossoming even more as it does under Rhonda's leadership, and the children of our city and their families being transformed and touched in greater and greater numbers by the love of Christ. I see on the road ahead of us an expanding youth ministry where more and more young people find a level of support, fellowship, and life-giving love that truly does change their lives and provides them with a foundation, a firm foundation, as they enter adulthood, a foundation of faith. I see on the road ahead of us the What's Next ministry with the vision of Denny Hammock and David Parr and others already focusing on it, expanding to transform countless other young lives. They're already dreaming that. I see on the road ahead of us the doors of this building being open even more than they already are to groups such as AA and Al-Anon, continuing to fulfill our leaders' view that this wonderful structure itself is part of our mission. I see on the road ahead of us numerous new musical programs similar to what we're already offering to the Charlotte community, as well as new forms of worship, seeing even more blessings as we have already experienced today with Tyrus's leadership here and his sharing from the heart. I see on the road ahead of us the Stephen ministry and care for veterans and assistance to those in need continuing to grow and touch lives. I see on the road ahead of us a church filled with fellowship activities that are just plain fun as well as enriching. I see on the road ahead of us a bold new transformation of the St. John's campus on Monroe Road, a rebuilding of that house of God, so to speak, that will make it a vibrant place of creative new worship experiences and a community center, and who knows what else. Welcoming all and truly changing lives, others' lives, and our hearts. All of these are ministries in our past and in our present, but rather than looking at them only in the rearview mirror, I see them on the road ahead of us, just as Haggai proclaimed, and that they will all have a greater glory. I see a bright future for our church by God's grace and God's power, all to the glory of God. That's what I see for our church, and this church to which I hope you will prayerfully commit your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, and your witness. Your commitment of generosity to this vision of the future of our church will make it a reality. So as we close, I ask you to contemplate where God is calling you this day. What is God calling you into? What new ministry? What new challenge? What is God saying to you in your heart? Are you that person who I mentioned earlier, who may have a calling from God that we haven't even seen yet? If so, praise be to God. Praise be to God.